If you want the most premium experience on an iPad, but you aren't ready to say goodbye to the home button just yet, then today's your lucky day, I guess. Because today, I'm going to be reviewing and giving a 2021 perspective on the 2019 iPad Air 3, the last non-budget iPad Apple has sold with a home button. I've been using this iPad as my daily driver for the past year, and back in 2019, I would have recommended this tablet to everybody. It was value-packed, sporting essentially the same performance as the iPad Pro at the time, along with maintaining a somewhat affordable price. But in 2021, times have definitely changed, so today, I'm going to be giving my thoughts on the iPad Air 3 from a 2021 perspective, including an in-depth review, whether you should still pick one up, and if you're currently using one, should you upgrade? So back in 2019, the iPad Air 3 was released as a successor to the iPad Air 2 from 2014, giving the iPad Air line an update for the first time in 5 years. It was intended to be an upper mid-range device, sporting better internals than the base level iPad, but lacking the bells and whistles found on the iPad Pro. And it was incredible value for money when it first came out, mainly because it had the same chipset as the iPad Pro, and therefore basically the same performance. Although it was lacking other high-end features like the all-screen design, better cameras, and high refresh rate display. Now since then, it's been replaced by the iPad Air 4, but the Air 3 is still extremely high-end spec-wise, and it still feels like a super premium device. It sports the same blazing fast chipset as the iPhone XS, and has a gorgeous immersive display, along with an ultra-thin and portable design. So if you're currently using one, you don't need to upgrade for quite a long time, and I'm talking 5 to 6 years down the track. There's really just one minor problem with this tablet in 2021, and that's the price. The iPad Air 3's $600 average price on the used market would actually be okay value if it wasn't for the iPad 8th Gen, which sports the same processor as the Air 3 and therefore pretty much the same performance, and can be bought brand new from Apple for basically the same price, maybe a bit less. But basically everything else about it is a downgrade, from the thicker design, to the lack of subtle display features, to the lower storage options. So if you don't mind sacrificing a few hair-splitting features, then for the average user, that's probably going to be the better buy, since it's cheaper and you're not running the risks of buying second-hand, such as the device potentially having low-quality replacement parts that you don't know about until you get it. Believe me, I've been there. But with that in mind, the Air 3 is the more premium device, and as I said earlier, it's the last iPad with a home button that Apple will probably ever release that was intended for users who wanted a high-end experience. So if you want to keep around the home button, but you also want a premium device, then ta-da, this is the one. Although again, if you're looking to save a bit of money, don't forget about that brand new iPad 8th Gen with the same chipset, albeit with the subtle downgrades I talked about earlier. And so with all of that out of the way, let's take a closer look at how the iPad Air 3 holds up in 2021, starting off with the design. In terms of design, some of you might think that this device looks a little familiar, and you're perfectly right to think that, because the iPad Air 3 uses a near identical design to the 2017 iPad Pro, minus the top speakers. Now even though this tablet uses the shell of an older product, the overall appearance is quite stylish, as well as it being extraordinarily thin and light, coming in at just a 6.1mm thickness and weighs only 652 grams, while maintaining a large and immersive 10.5-inch display size, which makes it one of the most portable tablets in the market. And in addition to that, you also get the functionality of the home button with Touch ID. Touch ID on here is ridiculously fast, some might say even unnecessarily fast, since you barely even have to brush past the sensor with your finger and you'll be in. Although it is worth noting that because of that home button, you are sacrificing an all-screen design like on the new iPad Air and on the iPad Pros, but the bezels are pretty thin nonetheless, especially the ones on the side adjacent to the home button, so there isn't really that much of a sacrifice in screen real estate anyway. It's sort of like the perfect combination of having as little bezel as possible, but still retaining the convenience of the home button and Touch ID, giving it a bit of a timeless feel, and that's why I actually like this design better than the new all-screen one. Now on the aluminium back, we've got the Apple logo as always, and the rear camera sensor on the top left, along with the rear mics in the middle. Other notable features on the iPad Air 3's exterior include the smart connector for use with magnetic keyboards, along with volume and power buttons, and no, you're not seeing things, there's also a headphone jack. Now the speakers on the bottom definitely get pretty loud, and you can clearly hear whatever you're listening to with excellent bass, but sometimes the bass can be a bit overpowering, if you know what I mean. But aside from that, they're punchy, loud, and they're absolutely fine. In the middle of the two 2 speakers, we also get a lightning port which is compatible with 18-watt fast charge, but unfortunately no USB-C like on the new iPad Air or Pros. Now the display on the iPad Air 3 is really gorgeous, being a 10.5-inch LCD Retina display with a resolution of 2224 by 1668 and a pixel density of 264 pixels per inch, meaning that whatever it may be showing will come off crispy and have a vibrant, immersive and clear quality to it. And as a bonus to all that, the display also sports features such as lamination, anti-reflective coating and True Tone. It also gets pretty bright too, capping at 500 nits, so work in bright outdoor environments will be just fine. And just to reiterate from before, even though this tablet doesn't sport the all-screen design, the bezels are still very small and there's honestly barely any difference. However, the iPad Air 3 display does miss out on that 120Hz refresh rate like on the iPad Pro lineup. But I mean, unless you need it for gaming or art, I don't really consider it to be much of a drawback, and 60Hz is absolutely fine for the vast majority of people. All in all, this display is gorgeous, and games to movies to articles to documents will all look really nice. And to top it all off, the iPad Air 3's display is also compatible with the first generation Apple Pencil, meaning that you can use it to handwrite text, such as notes for class, or for artistic purposes with apps such as Procreate. Now keep in mind that only the first generation Apple Pencil is compatible here, not the second gen, so you'll unfortunately have to resort to the incredibly awkward ritual of charging it through the device's lightning port instead of connecting it to the side. But the battery on the Apple Pencil usually lasts around maybe a week, so it's not really something you'll be doing too often anyway. Moving on to the performance and internals, this is yet another area that the iPad Air 3 really excels in, even though it's now 2 years old. We're given the Apple A12 Bionic chipset along with 3GB of RAM, so performance is pretty much equivalent to the iPhone XR, XS and XS Max, as well as the 3rd and 4th gen iPad Pro, all of which boast extremely high-end experiences. I've actually gone ahead and installed the iPadOS 15 beta on here, and I think it's pretty safe to say that it runs just as well as iPadOS 14. To put it simply, you won't be having any issues with the performance on the iPad Air 3 for many years to come. It'll handle pretty much any task you throw at it, and swiping around the interface and opening apps will be lag-free and buttery. Its power allows for tasks like high-resolution video editing, intensive mobile gaming, Photoshop and design, and therefore light tasks like YouTube, Netflix and document typing will be even more of a breeze. Apple really does an amazing job at keeping their older devices supported and running smoothly for a long time, and the iPad Air 3 is no exception. In fact, it's highly likely that it'll still be pretty usable on its final software version in around 5 to 6 years time, but the main takeaway here is that there's really nothing to worry about in terms of performance on the iPad Air 3. Now let's take a break from praising and groveling the iPad Air 3 in all of the areas that it nails, and move on to its mediocre camera setup. On this device, we're looking at an 8-megapixel shooter on the rear and a 7-megapixel FaceTime HD lens. I'm really not going to sugarcoat this, the camera setup on this device isn't great, but I guess to call it terrible would be a little harsh. But I mean, these photos are pretty self-explanatory for how iffy they are. Colors are not terribly accurate, and the exposure could use a little improvement, as well as content being kind of grainy most of the time. Now in terms of video recording, the iPad Air 3 can record up to 1080p at 30 frames per second on both cameras, but don't get too excited, it's just as meh as the photo quality. But at the same time, perfectly fine for activities like video calling, just like the photo quality is good enough for scanning documents. And like all 5 out of 10 cameras on consumer electronics, if you have a decent bit of lighting, you can actually get some half-impressive shots. But let's be real, no one's using their iPad as their main camera anyway. And again, these shooters do the job well enough for what they were intended for, scanning documents and video calling. You know what does the job more than well enough though? The battery life. Obviously, it's not going to be as good as the most recent iPads, but with moderate to heavy use, it does get me through a full day, and I usually end the day with around 20 to 30%. So there's really no issues here with the battery life, even for power users. Plus I mentioned that it also supports 18-watt fast charge, so that's also a bonus. And so to wrap up this review, the iPad Air 3 is basically the last premium iPad to sport the home button. For many, it's not going to be the best value to buy used, but in 2021, it's still incredibly powerful and capable. Plus, it's the best experience out of an iPad you can get while still retaining that home button. And by that, I mean blazing fast performance, a battery life to last you all day, and a gorgeous display. So if you're currently using one, there's really no need to upgrade. As for buying one, if you're okay with buying used, and you want the most premium tablet out there that still has a home button, then this is probably the one for you. But I'm going to reiterate this once more, the iPad 8th Gen has the same chipset and can be bought brand new for around the same price, maybe a bit less, although it does have a few subtle downgrades, like again, the display, lack of storage options, and thicker design. But the iPad 8th Gen is still a perfectly solid device, so if you don't mind that, and you're not really into the tech spec side of things, then the iPad 8th Gen is probably the one to go with. But in a nutshell, Well, the iPad Air 3 is still solid in pretty much every aspect, and will be for many years ahead. And so that pretty much concludes my 2021 review of the iPad Air 3. If you enjoyed this video, or found it helpful in any way, please make sure you drop me a like, and subscribe to TechSpree for more reviews, comparisons, and the occasional unboxing. Thank you so much for watching. This is Tom with TechSpree, and I'll see you next time.